All right, you're checking out the Big Douglas Show. Make sure to subscribe, like, and hit the notification buttons down there. Today we got rapper Big Pooh is in the co-host chair. Big Pooh, what's happening?
Nothing much. Nothing much. Is ready to get in some of this Senior Bowl talk.
Longtime friend of the show, Nate Coleman's with us today. Nate, what's happening?
Gentlemen, thank you for having me on. I am ready to talk Senior Bowl.
And our special guest today from Rotoworld is Thor Nystrom. Thor, thanks for giving us some time today.
Thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Thor, I've been a big fan of yours for a while, keeping up with the stuff that you do. I assume since it's gray and cloudy behind you that you are not down at the Senior Bowl this week. Do you generally go to the Senior Bowl week?
You know, I actually have never been to the Senior Bowl. I've been to the Combine, but never the Senior Bowl. This was going to be my first year, but with the COVID, we didn't end up going down this year. So hopefully next year, this stuff's cleared up. Just a wonky year with all that stuff.
Or when do you usually start breaking down the players for the upcoming year? How long of a process is that?
I would say for me, it's 3 to 5 years. If I could flip and show you guys my screen, you would see a database that has thousands of players in it. And I got all kinds of data on all of them. So, I've been, for my usual job, one difference for me with some of the other NFL draft guys is I cover college football when it's football season. So I cover these kids from the time they get recruited on throughout their careers, and some of these kids I've seen them transfer once, some of them I've seen transfer multiple times. So just following them through their careers, I have all their PFF data, and I know a lot of their trials and tribulations. So I've been following them for a while.
That's awesome. When you're Thor, when you're keeping track of these guys, everybody has their own system, their own process, how they rank players, etc. Like, can you shine a little lighter on your process?
Sure. It's a great question. There's some people, in the scouting community or in the writing scouting community that are more old school with that, just like scouts, where it's like the eye test, and those are like the grind film kind of guys. And they go mostly off what they're seeing in, generally what is a 3 to 4 game, sometimes 5 game sample size, of cut-ups when they're watching these games. Other guys are highly analytically driven. The data and I'm not just talking stats. I'm talking about breaking down combine data that gives us an insight into, generally this is the type of player that, or type of athletic outcome that has succeeded going into the NFL, et cetera, and trying to sort of decrease your variance on picks and prospects, by getting that sort of data. I would say that I'm probably about in the middle of those two camps. I watch a ton of football for my job. I also break it down, once we get into January outside of the season, start breaking down the draft prospects again. And I love the data as well. That's why I keep the database. Like I said, I add all like the PFF grades. I add a bunch of the other data. I'm going to have, by the end of it, I'll have all their Spark scores and adjusted Spark scores and RAS scores and, all their different measurements and wingspans and all the 40-yard dash and all sort of stuff. So for me, it's more of a holistic thing, understanding both sides of it, understanding also that sometimes your own eyes can deceive you. And not only that, but, when you're watching a 3 or 4 game sample on a kid, because no one has the time, even someone who has a job like me, no one's got a time to go through 1,500 kids and watch a 24 game catalog on every single one. So you're getting, when you're going through and watching the kids, you're getting a smaller sample size on what is a smaller player pool anyway. So finding extra info to augment your understanding of these players, and also understanding even the ones that you're watching, more has happened in their career and in their life than you're seeing right there. So I just feel like it's incumbent upon, the individual evaluator to weigh as much information as humanly possible when they're sort of like stacking a rankings board or whatever.
Gotcha. Well, follow-up question. When you're doing the 3 to 5 game sample size, are you picking the toughest games, like their toughest opponents, for that sample?
Yeah. So sometimes you get a choice, like The Alabamas, your Clemsons, your Auburns, your big time schools, you'll get a choice because the catalog, every game was televised. And so invariably every one of those games will be available. And a lot of times a cut up of each individual player on those schools is available. Sometimes when you're breaking down a kid from, UL Monroe or Texas State or something like that, you don't get as much of an option. But the good thing with that is typically the games that were televised, that we do have access to their tape, because someone like me, I don't have access to like the all 20. Like I wish I had like, access to like, the all 22 Omega database, that's like sort of mythical in everyone's head, like, coaches have or whatever. But we don't, we just sort of have to scrounge around for what's available on the internet. And a lot of times it's just cut up of what the telecast was. So, but the smaller school kids, a good thing is that generally the stuff that's available is against their better competition. You're not gonna have a UL Monroe against their FCS opponent game. That's not going to be televised anyway. So, that's how I do it. But yeah, to your point, like, if it's if it's like Deontay Brown or like an Alabama offensive lineman that I'm breaking down, when I'm looking through the games, in last season, I'm going to be thinking about the best interior defensive lineman that they played all year. I want to see him against the best competition for sure.
But you don't have all 22 of Quinn Miners for like 4 years.
Yeah, I'm going to be lucky to get what I can on that kid. I'm going to have to hit up my buddy Jim Nagy to give me some tape on that kid.
Yeah.
So let's get into prospects that Washington could be looking at, because that's mostly what we're concerned about here. We're at 19. Are there positions, Thor, that you just keep off the table for those first round picks?
How do you mean by that?
Well, like some people say, taking safety in the first half is there's no point in it, or drafting running back. Nobody wants to draft a running back in the first round. Just curious, as the league shifts, if there's certain positions that you don't even consider taking in the first round at this point.
Yeah, just because the analytical bent, I have some of those biases, I would say, but I would also say that there's exceptions to every rule. Like obviously, tight end had been sort of a depreciated position as well in the draft recently. And I was the first guy banging the drum for TJ Hawkinson to be a top 10 pick, just for instance. I do think that there's prospects that sort of break the mold even for their positions in terms of the value you can get back out of them. But like I said, like even the Clyde Edwards-Helaire pick, I was like, I probably would have taken a different player there, but
you can make a good argument that this year there's a chance Najee Harris could go in the first round, and maybe even ETN. I mean, it probably won't happen, but I would expect one running back to potentially go off the board, and maybe Najee Harris to the Steelers, with their pick.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have some high upside running backs here, and some running backs that can do a couple different things. Harris would be a great fit for the Steelers. I mean, it just seems like it's a match made in heaven. It's exactly what they need. It going back years, he's the kind of running back that they love. Only it's sort of the next evolution of that. He's getting comped a lot to Matt Forte. I like him he's a little bit sexier than Matt Forte. So I feel like that does him a little bit of an injustice. But a lot of the same stuff is there, where you're talking like a bigger, more physical back who he's an awesome receiver, has a huge catch radius. You throw it anywhere around him, he's going to come down with the ball, and he's extremely difficult to tackle. His broken tackle numbers, especially in space in college, were ridiculous. So yeah, I mean, he definitely has a shot because of the different things that he can add to an offense. He is one of those guys that potentially, like Edwards-Helaire, because of the receiving contributions, could sort of break that first round barrier for sure. And then, just to your point of ETN, everyone wanted him to declare before last season, and he didn't. Into the last class, and he actually had a down running year this year because Clemson had, like, his rushing stats weren't quite as good. Clemson had a few offensive linemen that left, and obviously they didn't play as many games. But the one cool thing has been to see his evolution as a receiver the last couple of years. Like earlier in his career, he sucked at being a receiver. It's not just that he was like, raw. Like, he was not a good receiver, and admittedly so. He told reporters he wasn't comfortable at it. They'd send him out on routes, and it was like, he had two left thumbs and two left feet. Like, He just wasn't good at it. And he was totally honest with reporters like that was the area of his game that he had to focus in on and try to improve. And, I think a big part of the reason why he came back was he told Clemson's coaches, like, I want to be used like an NFL running back in the passing game. And that part of his game just took a huge step forward, huge step forward. And to me, even though his rushing stats were down, he has potentially given himself a shot. To your point, I don't think that it will happen, but I think he's given himself a shot to get taken in the first round because of how good he's gotten in the receiving game. To me, he would not have had a shot to go in the first round when you're talking about a guy that doesn't catch passes. But now he's got the shot.
I know that Mac Jones at the Senior Bowl is the rave because he's Mac Jones and played for Alabama. But we also had another name pop up this week for us novices, Jamie Newton. Most of us haven't seen him play. He didn't play this year. What is the excitement about Newman, and where do you kind of see his, him falling or going in the draft? I mean, he goes from a person nobody has really heard of. Obviously wasn't discussing him, among the top quarterbacks this year. But where do you guys see him kind of falling in the drafts after his Senior Bowl week?
Yeah, he's a really interesting prospect. And, this year for the last year's draft was an unprecedented draft because the pre-draft process was disrupted so much. This year is going to be an even more of an unprecedented draft because the most important piece of information that prospects give to their prospective future employers during this draft process is their last season of tape. And a lot of these guys, to your point about Newman was an opt-out. Trey Lance only played one game. We had several other opt-outs. We had several guys that played 2 games, 3 games. So a lot of these guys, they're the most important thing that you would typically look at as part of their evaluation. You either have a partial or you have none at all. And Newman's super interesting. I remember when he first came in, I think it was when he was like the end of his freshman year, might've been his second season at Wake Forest. But when he came in, he immediately sort of flashed for their offense, not as sort of a star player, but a guy, was sort of frisky and was doing things. And I immediately thought that guy plays a lot like David Garrard. And I think I even tweeted it like at the time, this is a couple years ago. And it's funny looking around now because I've seen him getting comped to David Garrard during the draft process. And I always he has that same sort of build. He has that same sort of game. What's interesting about him is he's a dual threat kid who's built really big. And so especially, I mean, I think all football fans just kind of like that guy in general, especially when they can uncork the deep ball, because that's the other big part of his game. Although the caveat on that was Newman was always much better when Sage Surratt was on the field, their monster outside receiver. And then when he was out, Newman wasn't quite as good, but Newman is very, very good down the field. He has good accuracy downfield, and he's got a good arm. And then you're talking about a really big, well-built, fortified kid who can get out of the pocket and run. And as a Vikings fan, I don't think Newman's arm is this good, but we had a guy that was like this for a couple of years and was so fun to watch, Dante Culpepper. So I just have a natural sort of inkling for players like that. I think the things that concern you are he opted out last year and he wasn't super experienced to begin with. He also there's inexperience there, but there's also a rawness to his game in the pocket. Number one, hurrying through his reads, stuff like that, just not being comfortable about what's going on, not sort of moving with his environment or manipulating the pocket stuff, just sort of things that you learn as you go on and with coaching and stuff like that. But also with the system that he was playing in, there's a lot of BS that goes on with the Wake Forest offense. It's really fun to watch, but it's just a super college ACC kind of offense where it runs at, breakneck tempo. And then they're doing a lot of RPO, run back to the line, RPO, handoff. And now we're going to, chuck it deep to Sage Surratt. And Newman was just awesome in that system, but it's not translatable. You're not going to try to run 90 plays a game in the NFL with this system. And then you just have this one receiver, who's 6'5" that you throw jump balls to against 5'10" ACC receivers. It doesn't work that way. If it was, he would be a top 5 pick. But because of these other questions to his game, you're talking about more of the sort of boomer bust type proposition where he has, certainly some intriguing tools, but then he has these other things that definitely hint at a higher bust profile. So for me, he's a day two guy because the ceiling's high enough that it warrants some sort of draft capital in the investment. He's done enough things in college and in a Power Five conference. I would have loved to have seen him play this year. It's hard to criticize a kid for opting out. That's a personal decision, but he was sort of airmailed into he created it for himself, but it was a perfect situation at Georgia. Georgia started Stetson Bennett, who is just, he's a prototypical like 4-string quarterback that all these, blue blood programs have. Like in baseball, you consider him like an organizational soldier in the minor leagues. Never should have seen the field because Jamie Newman was supposed to be their starting quarterback. And again, it just would have been a great situation. They had George Pickens and all these, awesome receivers outside, and very deep at running back, Zamir White and all these different dudes. But we didn't get to see him this year in that system. That also we would have been able to see him throw more in the intermediate range and stuff like that. So there's a lot of question marks with Jamie Newman, but if it gets into the third round and my team just, I have a team with, that ends up with one of the older starters or whatever, and I'm going to need a starter in a couple years, and I need a guy to groom. I'm definitely going to use my third round pick on Jamie Newman because the ceiling at that point is going to justify it. At that point, there's going to be no other quarterback that has the ceiling that he does.
I'm obviously biased, but we were excited to get Newman down in Athens. And when he opted out, to your point, Thor, you never knock a man for making a personal decision, but his stock needed that year. I mean, you saw what JT Daniels did when he finally got healthy. I think they assumed that he'd do something similar. And to your point, it was tough to watch Stetson Bennett.
Yeah, I will say once Desmond Ridder came back to Cincinnati, he kind of left a little bit of a gap or a void in that QB class. And I think Newman can kind of like fill that gap in a way because he could be that quarterback 6 or 7 that's right there with maybe right after Kyle Trask, something like that, because he is one of the only dual threat quarterbacks available that still has upside that you would consider in day 2. So I like him not a lot, but he was kind of volatile, just like he was during his career. He was pretty volatile at the Senior Bowl from what I read. So he's intriguing for sure, though.
Yeah, and just to your point, talking about obviously you have the big 5 at quarterback. No one's going to break that at this point, but talking about the guys that are in contention for sort of that, next, whether you call it the second tier or the third tier, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever. There's not a ton of guys that super duper excite you, outside of that top 5, outside of Newman. So it's not something to scoff at. I mean, like, I don't like Sam Ehlinger. I don't think he's an NFL quarterback. I think Kellen Mond is super limited. I don't see him becoming much in the NFL. I'm intrigued by Shane Buechele, but intrigued in sort of like a 5th round, 6th round flyer kind of a way. Davis Mills has some tools, but he's the same sort of a thing. He's a midday 3 flyer kind of a kid. So it's like, to your point, there's just not a lot of guys after the top 5. So I do think Newman's going to be going on day 2 because, once those 5 guys go, whether it's in the first round or whether one of them drops to the top of the second, but at that point, there's going to be teams that still need a quarterback and they're going to be like, oh shit, there's all the quarterbacks are gone. One of them is going to have to make a play for a guy like Newman. I don't see another guy that you can make an argument has the upside of him. Kellen Mond most certainly doesn't. Sam Ehlinger most certainly doesn't. Buechele flashes it with the arm sometimes, but he's got his warts as a prospect as well. And Newman's tools are better than his. So yeah, I think I'm with you on that.
How do you grade a guy like Jones who has all those weapons around him and obviously won't be able to play with that kind of supporting cast at the next level? How do you make sure to not knock a guy for the players that he has, but at the same time, trying to study the guy?
Yeah, it's tough. with that, I mean, it was similar with Tua. It's been similar with a lot of these Alabama quarterbacks, and Jalen Hurts, in the same way going to Oklahoma. And with Jones, it's especially interesting because he's a guy that on his own he's not a tremendously gifted singular talent on his own, right? He doesn't offer much mobility. He doesn't have a howitzer for an arm. And so he is a guy who would naturally be elevated by an elite supporting system. He just is, so it turns out he was sort of the perfect quarterback for that system. But yeah, you project him to the NFL, you don't want a quarterback who needs to be elevated by his supporting cast. That's sort of the definition of a replaceable NFL quarterback. So yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting. But yeah, I mean, as far as Mac Jones, I think, just in terms of with other people, I think I'd probably be a little bit lower on him. I think the things that you saw that he was really good at is, short to intermediate accuracy, timing, placement, touch, etc. But in that sort of area, very good timing, stuff like that. And he also had good, really good, numbers under pressure. Although sometimes, there would be the thing where he would like wait until the last second and then he would just sort of loft it up because he knew like Najee Harris had sort of snuck out, and then Najee Harris would get a free 30 yards, or, they would have that stuff with like the tight end would, start blocking, and then he'd trail off and then he'd be wide open. So, but I'm sort of nitpicking him a little bit, but he is good under pressure in general. But yeah, I mean, for me, there's, again, he's not very athletic and he has sort of a mediocre arm. And so, as far as like using a mid first round, I just wouldn't use a first round pick on a guy like that.
Nate, let's talk about the big uglies. I'm about finding diamonds in the rough on the offensive line, and I'm pretty sure the Senior Bowl has more than a few diamonds in the rough. I'm under the belief you can never have too many good offensive linemen, or at least developing ones. Can you give us one or two offensive linemen in the Senior Bowl or down there for Senior Bowl week that you saw that really flashed?
Yeah. So, I mean, the star of the Senior Bowl, and there's not enough superlatives to talk about this guy, but Quinn Miners out of Wisconsin Whitewater. If you don't know Wisconsin Whitewater, if you've never heard of it, I never heard of it until going to the Senior Bowl and watching it all. But I mean, this dude is just nasty. He was projected to be a 6th or 7th round draft pick, like coming into this. And a lot of scouts had him as undrafted apparently, but he impressed scouts all 3 days of practice. A lot of people are saying he's a day 2 pick now, could go like somewhere in the 3rd round, but he actually broke part of his hand during practice, and it was his right hand, which, he was playing as a center. So he uses that to snap the ball. But apparently he's still going to try to play in the Senior Bowl on Saturday, but this dude is just gritty. He doesn't really look like an athlete. When you look at them, he's got a big old beer gut, which I think a lot of people like. He's kind of like your everyman, but I was reading about him that he actually became a lot more technically savvy because he went to a few of those O-lineman camps and really refined his craft and became more of a technician in the off season. But I mean, this guy is just skyrocketing up the board. And I think he's the talk of the town as far as offensive linemen go. And you could see him go sometime in round 3, and he could go as a center or a guard. But for Washington, I mean, people talk about Washington like we have our offensive line locked down, but offensive tackle is still a need. Just because Lucas had one good season, it doesn't mean he's your future or anything like that. You still need to be looking for depth and frontline starters. So that's something to consider. And, you also you don't know what's going to happen with Brandon Sheriff. So guard could be a big need as well. So definitely something to look at. But yeah, Quinn Miners definitely stood out for me. And another guy I really liked is out of East Carolina, Deontay Smith. He had the longest arms there at the Senior Bowl, and he just stood out every day in practice. There were a bunch of positive notes about him, and no one really had anything bad to say about him. And you never know with those small school guys until they get out there competing with guys from bigger schools, but he really held his own. And I think he did a lot for his draft stock. I could see him going on day 2 as well.
Thor, when we're looking at 19 there, I know that the team is going to be interested in quarterback this year. Do you package those picks to go out and get a guy that's already proven himself in the league? Or are there some quarterbacks in this draft that you'd be willing to package picks together to move up for?
If it was me, I would be trying to draft a quarterback. If I was in Washington's situation, I don't, like some of these price tags that have been bandied about for some, like I saw the price tag on Watson appears to be 3 first round picks plus a couple young studs. I just don't know why you would pay that if you have a franchise that has a Swiss cheese roster. It's prohibitive. Football is a 22-man game. Well, it's more than that, but you're going to have to surround them with something. The way to win in the NFL is to find a rookie stud quarterback that you don't have to pay much in the salary cap, and then augment him with talent around him, and then you pay the other positions in free agency. This is a tried and true formula. Absolutely not would I trade those picks for a veteran quarterback. You're going to screw over your salary cap for years, and you're going to just be playing a losing game. You just got to keep trying to find that quarterback in the draft, in my opinion.
Is Devontae Smith wide receiver number 1?
I haven't made that decision yet. But man, did he make a compelling case this year? Yeah, it's probably him against Jamar Chase. But yeah, he's really close, and he's like, I don't know if you guys, like in middle school, you have those trapper keepers where it's like the magic eye and you put it in front and then you like moved it out and it like changed the thing you were looking at. It's sort of trick. Like, it's kind of like Devontae Smith when you're watching him on, you're just watching him, like he should not be as good as he is. Like he's just like consistently beating guys that are bigger and faster than him just over and over and over again. And eventually you just have to throw up your hands and say, that's the way it is. I mean, he has a way of playing that makes bigger guys smaller and faster guys slower. He can erase their angles, and he can put their feet in quicksand. He just makes their movements slower. He makes them question themselves even when they're covering him, et cetera. So yeah, him against Chase is an interesting one, because Chase, I mean, he was the, obviously the consensus wide receiver number 1, but it's not like he's a prospect that's like, doesn't have any questions whatsoever. He's not going to be an athletic, super freak marvel. So it's not like I think that, his sort of hold on wide receiver 1 is unimpeachable. They're two extremely, extremely different kinds of wide receivers. So really the answer probably comes to, what does your specific offense need? Because they're both sort of elite, just at their sort of different ends of the spectrum of what they do. But yeah, I still got to parse it out individually, because of course, when you make rankings, you're not doing it with a specific franchise or a specific offensive schema. You don't have guys on your roster already. You just have to sort of make it in this weird vacuum, where everything else is equal, which isn't really reality, but you sort of have to pretend.
Nate, one of the areas the Washington football team desperately needs to improve in is linebacker. I can assume they're not going linebacker with the first round pick. Who do you see on day 2 that Washington can target that help improve the depth and the front line of the linebacking core?
I think some people might say Dylan Moses here if he falls, but I'm sort of scared of Dylan Moses now. Dylan Moses had his injury, and then he was just awful this year. He was not good. They won the title, but Alabama had all kinds of issues on defense, and a lot of them, to me, point back at Dylan Moses, and they had really shoddy safety play as well. But a lot of the shoddy linebacker play goes back to Dylan Moses, and I'm not really sure what his deal is. He was actually a little bit better in coverage this year, but against the run and as a pass rusher, he was noticeably down from what he was earlier in his career. So for me, I would probably shy off a guy like that. Chaz Surratt is a guy that I like. He's super smart, the kid from UNC. He used to be a quarterback, and he sort of plays linebacker like that. He sort of, has an understanding of what the offense is trying to do, and sort of has an understanding of, what he can do to go about stopping that, et cetera. So I just sort of like the way he plays the game. That'd be another guy. I don't think I'm not sure where people see Nick Bolton going right now. But maybe they see him as a first rounder, but if he was a guy that made it into the second round, that would be a guy I'd probably be interested in too. He just makes a shit ton of tackles. He's really instinctual. I really like instinctual defensive players, and even though he's not gonna test as like some sort of athletic god or whatever, but he's not unathletic either. He just has some high end speed limitations, but for the kind of player he is, he should be fine. Just don't put him on islands in coverage against, receivers or, elite move tight ends, and he's going to be fine. So those are a couple guys.
Yeah, I would say with linebacker, lots of times some teams philosophically refuse to draft an off-ball linebacker in the first round. And I kind of understand why, unless you have like a can't miss prospect. Like a lot of people say Micah Parsons is that this year, but linebacker is definitely high on the totem pole of needs for Washington. You heard Ron Rivera talk a lot about needing a quarterback of the defense, and he sees that in a linebacker. He's probably looking for the next Luke Kuechly, but I think with this class, it's a really deep class. So I don't think there's any need to reach on a linebacker at pick 19. Now, maybe if you're trading back in round one and going to the end of round one, then you can look at someone like Bolton or another linebacker like that. But there's a lot of depth in this class. I mean, you have Bolton, you have Collins, you have Surratt, Moses. There's a lot of them. And then you talked about Jock too. There's quite a few that are still good on day 2, day 3, and you can still get production from those guys. I mean, people talk about linebacker being such a huge need for Washington, but I mean, their defense was great this year and we didn't have that good a linebacker play. So is it that big of a difference? I'll tell you a big need that no one is talking about with Washington is cornerback. I mean, if Darby is out, Darby's only a 1-year player, so he's a free agent now. So we need to either re-sign him or find someone else. And there's a good chance at pick 19, you could be looking at the cornerback or cornerback 3 there. So, I mean, that's something to consider that no one's really talking about.
Thor, how do you like the way that Leatherwood and Darisaw stack up? Who do you give the nod to there? Because that's another option Washington could look at 19.
I like Darisaw. I really liked watching Virginia Tech this year because they were just mauling people.
His stock is soaring, right?
Yeah. He's a fun player to watch, and like there's a big difference between him and Leatherwood in terms of like when they came in. Darisaw, he didn't get anything handed to him. He was not a big time recruit or nothing like that. But he ended up starting at Virginia Tech as a true freshman anyway. And was a stud, sort of coming up. And, he's just like a mauling kind of tackle. And they had I went to Kansas for undergraduate and we had this backup running back named Khalil Herbert who played behind Puka Williams. And then Khalil Herbert transfers to Virginia Tech and all of a sudden turns into this stud back because he's running behind this mauling offensive line. Khalil Herbert's like this, like little bowling ball kind of a runner. And but he got playing behind this offensive line in Darisaw, and he was just he had room to run all over the place. So I prefer him. Leatherwood still has he's got some quirks to his game that I'm not sure he's ever gonna completely fix. I think he's a flawed prospect who might just be a flawed player. Doesn't mean that he can't start in the NFL, but I just think he might just have sort of a glass ceiling on who he is.
Nate, can you give us some names of another trouble spot on a vaulted Washington defense? Free safety. It seems we've been having problems at safety since the late Sean Taylor passed. Can you give us some names there that Washington fans and should definitely keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so they're calling Richie Grant Richie Rich at the Senior Bowl. I guess he's the biggest defensive standout there. And going into the Senior Bowl, he was kind of looking like maybe he could go on day 2, but this guy had like 3 picks in practice. He's been buzzing. Just everyone's been talking about him all 3 days here. So he's actually playing out of a smaller school in South Florida. So it's kind of surprising there, but Richie Grant's been a guy who stands out. I could see him going in the top 50 picks, maybe round 2. And that's something Washington would be interested in, but I don't think safety is like top heavy this year, but on day 2, there's like 3 or 4 really excellent prospects that they're going to be looking at because you don't know what you have in Jeremy Reeves. Like I understand he played good for a few games, but it's a really small sample to go off of. And Curl is more of your box safety. So they definitely need to get some depth there and get some frontline talent. So obviously Richie Grant's someone they're going to be looking at.
Thor, how does Kyle Pitts stand up to some of the tight ends that we've seen go early in the last couple of years?
I just think he's different than those kids. Like Hawkinson is the best prospect of them, but Hawkinson was, more sort of your prototypical inline guy that did both things. And Hawkinson was a stud blocker. Whereas Pitts is just like, he's just like a supernova elite jumbo receiver kind of a guy. He sort of does not fit into your traditional box kind of a thing. But he's going to improve your passing offense so much that I think he deserves potentially to be taken in the top 10 picks as well, even though he's not going to bring the same blocking facet to your team.
Yeah, it's something about him too is like people will be like, oh, he's kind of like Evan Ingram. He plays out in the slot a lot. Well, he doesn't really play out in the slot that much at Florida. He played in line as a blocker most of the time, and he was fine as a blocker. He's not going to blow your socks away. I mean, Hawkinson is definitely a better blocker, but he's adequate at blocking enough where he can get the job done. But I mean, if he was just a receiver, not even a tight end, if he was a receiver, I'd probably have him ranked in the top 5 still, just as a receiver. That's how good he is. So, I mean, you're talking about like a once in a lifetime prospect for a tight end. I mean, it doesn't happen that much, but I would take him in the top 10 easily and not hesitate about it.
Now, I mean, this is for either you gentlemen. We know who the presumptive number 1 pick is. It's going to be Lawrence, but I've seen different evaluations and mock drafts, early mock drafts of the number 2 quarterback off the board. In you guys' opinion, are you going Wilson? Or are you going Fields?
Yeah. So,
oh, good. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So for me, like it's Fields. If you look statistically, his numbers are pretty much the same as Trevor Lawrence. They're very similar in almost every regard. And people won't tell you that, but I mean, that's true, but obviously there's more to it than that. And Lawrence has a lot more experience, but if you're talking about quarterback too, I'll take Fields. I think as far as like how NFL teams like perceive it, most of them will probably have Wilson higher. I think Wilson will go before Fields, and I could even see Fields potentially dropping to the quarterback 4. But for me, he's the quarterback 2, and then Wilson slots in as that quarterback 3. Because I mean, he has a lot of questions to answer. Like, where was this before this year? He wasn't exactly like breaking out before now. So for Zach Wilson, I mean, I still have questions to answer. And then I think Trey Lance has some of the most upside in this class. But I mean, obviously, he has such a small sample, and the competition of he was playing against was pretty minimal. So there's gonna be a lot of questions to answer, but I mean, I think Washington is in play to trade up potentially for someone like Trey Lance. If you look at the Lions trading away Stafford and maybe trading back Jimmy Garoppolo, or you look at the Panthers potentially trading for Watson, or the Jets trading for Watson, there's a lot of puzzle pieces that we still don't know, but there's the opportunity for one of those quarterbacks to fall. And I think if any one of them fall, Washington has to be aggressive about moving up, because there's not going to be a quarterback like that after that. And there's probably not going to be a quarterback next year in the draft either. So far, the 2022 class is not looking great. I mean, obviously a lot of things can change, but I mean, I definitely think that's an option they need to be looking at.
I'll just echo Fields. I like Fields more than Wilson.
Okay. So that brings up a follow-up question there. When you grade those guys, how do you make sure that you're not grading the helmet? We've heard that a lot this cycle with Fields and Ohio State quarterbacks. What's the best way to kind of get out of that mold of judging and grading by the helmet?
Honestly, I think that's an issue that the guys that come from the NFL side have more, because I don't think they don't follow like the game on a week to week basis. And so like they come back in, they watch the film like in January or February, and what it evokes for them when they're watching just Fields, it's like, oh yeah, I remember the last Ohio State quarterback I watched, it was Dwayne Haskins, and so like they bring that sort of stuff in. I don't bring that stuff in. The offense at Ohio State was different with Justin Fields than it was with Dwayne Haskins. It's comparing apples and oranges. Justin Fields, he has some warts. There's a couple of things in there that not necessarily that it introduces a bust profile, but some things that you are sort of afraid of. One thing one thing that I like is he's very, very, for a dual threat kid, he's very methodical about going through his reads, very methodical about going through his progressions. He will go through them all. If he has to. But the sort of downside is he will hold on to the ball longer. And what he's waiting for is he likes to throw to guys that are one-on-one. He does not like to throw into tight windows. He's got a great arm. And this is probably something that was coached into him. This would be something to ask him. It would be interesting to know. But he avoided a lot doing the thing that Zach Wilson did all the time, where Zach Wilson would throw those YOLO balls and just try to fit it into like keyholes. Justin Fields never does that. And so because of this way that Justin Fields plays, sometimes he took an extra sack. He doesn't have as many, tight window throws on his resume, but he also just has absurd accuracy numbers. And if you look at his, like his receiving distribution, he peppers the ball, or his, sort of heat zone, he peppers the ball all over the place, because he's sitting back there and he's legitimately giving everyone a shot to get open. That's just the kind of quarterback he is. So, but what he's going to have to do more at the NFL level is he's going to have to, it's not even, I think people are going to argue that he has to hurry up. I don't even think it's that. I think he is going to have to become more comfortable using his natural arm ability and testing certain, tight window throws. He's just going to have to be more comfortable making certain of those. He's going to have to do them, because on some plays, there might not be, in the NFL, there might not be anything else that is available. And in college, he would just sit back there and he might take a sack, or he might end up scrambling. But in the NFL, that's what's not going to work for him. You can't just sit back there until a one-on-one situation is open like you can at Ohio State. So if I was to point to one thing of his that slightly concerns me in the NFL, it's that. But if someone else was on, they'd be like, "Oh, Dwayne Haskins busted and Ohio State quarter." It's just stupid and it's lazy. I don't have any time for that. If you want to watch Justin Fields though and talk about his game, like, I'm all about that. But yeah, as far as the other stuff, it's easy for me because I'm just watching them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, adding a caveat to that, I would say, like with scouting, the whole goal for evaluations is to try to eliminate as much bias as I can, right? That's why I use analytics. That's why I watch the film. So it's just lazy analysis. It's surface level analysis. If you look at the quarterbacks that have come out of Ohio State, not very many of them were highly touted. If you really think about it, some of them were great college players, but not a lot of them were 5-star quarterback prospects in high school. And then we're supposed to be, first round picks. A lot of them were, dual threat athletes that happen to play quarterback. So, and that's one thing. The second thing is, like, when you talk about throwing with anticipation. So Dak Prescott, when he came into the league, he liked to throw to receivers that were open versus throwing receivers open. And that was something that was sort of a knock for him. But, as he got more comfortable, as he developed and became a better pro, he started to throw more of those passes where he'd throw receivers open. So it's something you can learn. And obviously, like Thor mentioned, like Fields, he has the arm talent for that. He has the mental capacity to do something like that. So it's definitely something for me that's coachable.
Nate, with the draft coming up, not fairly soon, but soon enough, it has the potential to get real wonky in the first round, depending on where some of these quarterbacks land, the ones that's already in the NFL, and then of course the draft picks. But I want to focus on receiver. Obviously, we know Devontae Smith, Jamar Chase, 1 and 2. After that, Washington is in desperate need of a receiver. I know you have Bateman from out of Minnesota. You have Waddle from Alabama. You have Tony out of Florida. I believe you have, I can't remember his name. Is it Armani Rogers? So you have different receivers, all different types of receivers. What kind of receiver, or which one of them receivers do you think Washington should be focused on in day 2?
Yeah, so a lot of that's going to be driven by what happens in free agency, whether they can land one of those big dogs like Chris Godwin or Allen Robinson or Will Fuller, or, any of those guys. I'm not sure that they'll land any of those guys, just because, like, those guys get to pick the team they want to go to. You know what I mean? And I don't think they're going to be running to go sign with WFT. I mean, maybe one of them will, maybe one of them won't. But if you're talking about going into the draft and not really having that position filled, receivers got to be on the table for pick 19. I've seen a lot of people mocking Kadarius Toney at pick 19. I hate that pick. I don't think he should go in the first round. I think maybe he could go in the end of the first round. But if you look at him, he's a player who only has 1 year of production. He didn't do anything his junior year, his sophomore year, or his freshman year. Even he didn't break out until he was 21 years old. So, like, if you're going to draft a receiver in round 1 who wasn't productive in college, I think that's kind of crazy. I mean, it's kind of scares me a little bit, like Henry Ruggs, where, yeah, he's a freak athlete, he's going to get drafted early, but I'm not so sure about him. And he also has off the field issues that we haven't even really discussed. But if I had to pick a receiver, and I already know that Waddle, Smith, and Chase are off the board, and I had to pick one at 19, I think my choice would probably be Rashad Bateman. I mean, he checks every box analytically. He checks the box on film. He broke out at an early age. He dominated targets. I mean, there's really not a lot to knock him on. He's not going to be a freak athlete. He's not going to run like a 4.4 or anything like that. But he reminds me a little bit of like someone like Keenan Allen. He's a technician as a route runner, and he was doing that at an early age. And you hear people always harping on breakout age, early age. You're like, what does that mean? Like, the reason I like it is because when you're 18 years old, if you can go out there and dominate players that are 20, 21, you're dominating people that are older than you, and you're still beating them. And that's something he's done his entire career. So I feel really confident in Rashad Bateman. I feel really, and if you're going further down the list, this is a really deep class. So after that, we're talking about day 2. That's where I'm more interested in drafting receivers. But I mean, Rondale Moore, I would take Rondale Moore above Kadarius Toney straight up. And I know it's like, seems like a hot take or whatever, but for me, he just checks every box. Rondale Moore is out of Purdue. He's kind of 5'9". He reminds me of Steve Smith. Everyone compares him to Steve Smith, but he really does play like Steve Smith. This dude ran a 4.33, and that was like back in high school, allegedly. You know, those numbers are always like a little inflated or anything, but when you really start going down the list, I mean, there's so many guys that check boxes, and you don't have to reach for a receiver with this depth, but they need an outside like X receiver. And they also need a slot receiver. And this draft is just full of both of those. You have like Amari Rodgers that can play in the slot. You have Elijah Moore is another excellent player that pretty much checks every box as well. So there's plenty of options. And there's a lot of guys at the Senior Bowl that stood out too. You have Dwayne Eskridge, who was projected to be maybe a day 3 pick. And coming into this is a small school guy who no one was really talking about. He's also like 23 years old, so he's a little older, but I mean, he dominated the Senior Bowl, and now they're talking about him going potentially in day 2, maybe even in the top 50. So there's options out there for receiver, but they have to address the position. This is a position for Washington where they haven't had depth in maybe like 8 years.
Definitely.
Well, Thor, I appreciate your time today. This was a whole lot of fun. Could have done it all day long. Nate, we appreciate you jumping on the show with us today too. Love to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, have a good one.